Welcome to tonight's Farm Advisory Service webinar. So we are delighted to launch Series 3 of Sustainable Beef Systems, which this year focuses on finishing cattle. And tonight we are starting with nutrition. So Series 3, we will share expertise from farmers and industry specialists to maximise efficiency and drive finishing systems forward, whether that be from grass, cereals or a combination. In this three-part webinar series, we will look at KPIs, maximising daily live weight gains, feed efficiency, optimising health and meeting market spec to avoid penalties. And ultimately, we're looking at cost control to improve your bottom line throughout this series. Already, we have published the case study from Easter Howgate showing how they use 6 semen in their bee herd to produce bull beef finished at 13 months of age within market spec. So you can find all this on the Sustainable Beef Systems dedicated FADS page. So we're starting this series with nutrition, and in 2025 we've certainly faced a lot of challenges when we come to finishing rations this year, because much of the East Coast, where most of our finishers are located, experienced quite a dry summer, leading to forage shortages, and those of you that are cereal producers as well may have faced rejections for malting specification, leading to a surplus of feed barley. And certainly we've seen some variation in forage analysis coming through our labs over the last couple of weeks. So tonight we are going to get an overview of finishing systems, the 3 main systems and how their key performance indicators vary between them. And we'll also get an update on feed availability and prices. So sharing their knowledge with us tonight is SAC Consulting's ruminant nutritionist Lorna Shaw, who has extensive experience of finishing cattle rations from her time within SAC and prior to that working for a feed company.
Good evening, everyone. So yeah, it was really nice to see from Paul. We've got a bit of a variation going on, but we're gonna look at a number of different finishing systems throughout the next half an hour or 40 minutes or so. So hopefully we have covered most things for you, but there is opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to try and cover a range of finishing systems considerations for each and where we want to be targeting to try and optimize finishing as much as possible within our herds. So just to kind of kick us off, I kind of wanted to look at some kind of key performance indicators for finishing, depending on what our target age at slaughter is on our system. So I have looked at kind of target age at slaughter from about 12 months, which would be a typical kind of intensive bull beef type system, right the way up to 26 months, which would be more of a kind of grass-based extensive system. And we can see that the required daily live weight gain will vary throughout that time. In order to do this, I've assumed an average birth weight of 40 kilos. I know we will see a little bit of variation either side depending on breed. And I've assumed a finishing weight of 675 kilos. Again, we will find that kind of our more continentally bred animals will probably finish at a bit of a higher weight than that, whereas some of our natives will be finishing at a bit of a lighter weight. So we need to kind of take that into consideration, but I had to use an average somewhere. So I think this is just a good guide based on if you're aiming for a 16-month finish, for example, we need to be trying to aim for 1.3 kilos throughout lifetime to reach that goal. So we need to be thinking about what in our system we need to put in place to make sure we can achieve that. So maturity rate for cattle very much can depend on breed and genetics, but this is a really nice graph by AHDB, which looks at the frame size of animal and target weight and how it goes through stages to hit market specification. So we can see that small framed animals, which were more typically kind of our native bred animals, and particularly the really traditional type natives, so think kind of Highlanders, Galloways, breeds like that, they'll find that they go through a kind of fairly short rearing stage and quite a long growing stage, and then suit a kind of short finish. So they suit a kind of longer stage in their growing phase to kind of grow frame. Obviously, being a smaller framed animal, that little bit of extra protein to grow frame will benefit them a lot better, which is why we tend to find those types of animals going on to slightly more extensive or forage-based systems. Um, if we look at a medium framed animal, which is quite a lot of her kind of continental crosses, some of our kind of more developed native breeds will kind of fall into the medium category. We can see that compared to our native bred animals, they spend a lot less time. They still have a good stage in the growing stage, and then they'll spend a bit more time in finishing compared to a small framed animal. And then we've got our large framed animals that almost kind of can skip that growth stage, which will be our kind of really continentally bred animals. So think kind of purebred Charlies, Simmentals, those types of breeds. They will suit kind of almost skipping that growing stage as such and can go into quite an intensive finish, all of which we're going to look at this evening. So it just kind of gives a bit of kind of thought on, depending on breed, what we might choose for our finishing system to try and optimize gain. So moving on to looking at those in a bit more detail. Obviously, we've kind of split finishing, or even kind of the growing finishing stage into kind of three systems. So we have our semi-intensive systems, which the majority of folk attending this webinar at the moment are probably falling into that category. And we'll find for kind of our growing finishing periods, for them, once we've got to weaning, we're looking at quite kind of heavy preserved forage and kind of concentrate mix of a ratios, or like a ratio of both. And we'll find that those animals will fall into a typical finishing age of roughly between 16 to 20 months, give or take, some either side, depending on genetic advantages. So for that system, typically we're looking for a target gain of at least 1.2 kilos or above that. For intensive systems, we do have about 10% of attendees looking at intensive systems. So that'll be more of a kind of intensive, like bull beef type system, or we can do just an intensive kind of short, sharp finish for some kind of steers as well. We'll tend to find on that. And that'll be kind of more of a cereal protein mix, using straw as the main forage. And I'll discuss in a bit more detail about why it is so important that we look at a kind of more rougher fiber source such as straw in those rations, rather than trying to do them with a kind of hay or silage. Typical finishing age in intensive systems, roughly between 12 to 16 months. 16 months is the sweet spot, as for entire bulls, they have to be gone by this point. So that's the utter kind of cut off for them. However, if you did have steers on a more intensive system, we do have a bit of leeway. And target gains for them should be at least 1.4 kilos or above. Target gains can reach a lot higher, and in many cases, we can see gains of about 2 kilos plus a day as well. And for extensive systems, this is kind of more kind of grazing based systems. So looking at forage as the prominent source of nutrition throughout lifetime. So thinking kind of grass-based finishing in summer, grass silage, brassicas, and bale grazing. So we'll discuss that as well. Typically, we see finishing age is a lot older, 20 to 26 months. We can see, give or take a wee bit, and typically we're aiming for target gains of about a kilo plus a day. To kind of break that down to look at kind of feed conversion efficiency with the systems, we'll find that the feed conversion ratio will increase as the animal matures. So in simple terms, they have to eat more to gain a kilo of live weight gain. So trying to optimize growth early on is advantageous in just the fact it's taking us less feed to gain more weight. And we tend to find that that feed costs over those periods will differ as well. So in order to kind of take advantage of that and look at kind of a short finish, so those 12-month bull beef systems, we'll tend to find that feed costs on those systems are fairly high. But because it's a lot shorter a period, we find over the lifetime, fixed costs and feed costs are kind of between the low to medium bracket. As those age, feed costs will increase, but over a lifetime, or no, feed costs will decrease, but over a lifetime, we tend to find that the overall costs will increase. So it's trying to find a balance of both of those. So looking into systems in a bit more detail, I'm going to start first with semi-intensive finishing systems, which I think is quite fitting, given that the majority of attendees kind of are falling into this category. So basically, we're looking at a preserved forage with energy, with an energy and protein supplementation. That supplementation could look like a number of different things. We'll discuss a lot about feed prices in a wee bit longer, but at the moment, cereals are looking quite cheap, especially barley if you're especially up north in the border where we have, in some cases, a bit of an abundance of it. And we'll be supplementing with a protein source. We can have other options like manufactured kind of whole beef nuts as a good balancer option, or we can look at a kind of cereal balancer nut as well, along with byproduct feeding, so adding in kind of veg wastes or liquid feeds if available, depending on area as well. As I said earlier, target live weight gains for this type of system should be at least 1.2 kilos or above to make it efficient, and we'll look at a bit of costings in my next slide. And it really suits it can suit any breed because it's a nice kind of hybrid system. But typically you tend to find it'll be steers or heifers that go onto a semi-intensive finishing system. Bulls, because we need to have a bull finished by 16 months, they definitely suit a more intensive system as much as possible if we're finishing bulls on farm. And we do have some considerations and challenges with this type of system. Forage quality is probably the major one. Forage will make up the base of any ruminant ration. It's essential for a rumen to function properly, and we must have enough rumen degradable protein and energy in that ration for that rumen to be functioning properly, generating microbial protein and working as efficiently as possible. And that's the key to getting good growth rates. So knowing that forage quality is of utmost importance and getting as good a quality forage as possible. We will give a bit of an update about what forages are looking at this year a wee bit later. But I would, and I'm probably going to say it about 3 times in this webinar, and I'm really sorry, but please, please, please analyze your forage before you're looking at a ration to optimize efficiency. If we know the base, we can balance it and kind of try and optimize weight gain as possible. If we don't know what the base ration's doing, we're chancing it. We're just looking at luck. Feed availability can also be a big challenge. So we can be quite controlled in the area we're in as what feed's available, what opportunities we've got. There's a lot of variation as we go across the country in terms of what's available, what's handy. And we need to try and optimize that as much possible to what's local, what can your system hold. Feed space can be also another massive challenge, and we need to be making sure we've got sufficient feed space available for every animal to eat and to allow a good intakes throughout. And then we've also got challenges of labour, fuel and bedding. Quite often in these semi-intensive finishing systems, we're housed. So we have housing challenges. We've got to have labour to feed them every day. There's fuel and bedding costs to consider as well, along with vet med and looking at health as well, which we'll cover a wee bit more in the next webinar. So I kind of wanted to look at a kind of semi-intensive system, and I've taken this to a 16-month finish and started at kind of weaning. So we're in October now, so for a lot of spring calving herds, a lot of herds are starting to wean. So typical like kind of weaning weights we've had recently from clients have been around about in between 250 to 300 kilos. So I've started that at 275 kilo animal. And I've looked at a kind of silage, barley, and rapeseed meal mix. At the moment, we'll do a feed price update later, but at the moment, if we're looking at straights, rapeseed meal and soya tend to be the most competitive proteins we have available in the market. There is obviously others available, but I was just kind of looking at a cost-effective system as much as possible. So for growth, in order to kind of gain at least 1.2 kilos a day, we're looking at feeding around 13.5 kilos of silage. I've used a 35% silage average ME about 10.5, which is about the average we've seen across the mill so far, and about 12% protein. So quite an average beef silage. And we've balanced that with 3.5 kilos of barley, 0.9 kilos of rapeseed meal, and I did actually add minerals into my costings as well. Um, and that came out at about £1.32 per head, or £1.10 per kilo gain. And it's roughly taken 146 days before we reach 450 kilos and we can swap them onto a finishing ration. I then looked at what we need to do to up them for finishing, to take them right through to finish. And ideally, we need to be feeding around, on average, 16 kilos of silage, 7 kilos of barley, and 0.35 kilos of rapeseed meal. We can see in the finishing ration, we've dropped the rapeseed meal quite significantly and upped the barley. In order to get finished, we really need to be optimizing starch. Protein becomes less important once we get towards finishing, although it is essential that we've got sufficient levels of it for normal rumen function. It's not as crucial, and starch is the thing that will start putting the fat cover on. So we need to trying to get that balance right for an optimum finish. If we've got too much protein, we tend to find there's a bit of an energy loss to try and get rid of that extra protein, and that'll take away from that animal fully finishing as efficiently as possible as well. So for my finishing ration, upping the starch, we've managed to get daily live weight gain up to 1.4 kilos per day at £1.88 per head, or 1.34 cost per kilo gain. And there's 166 days on the ration. So I've looked at this as to find out, so what is our average cost per kilo gain on that ration? And that was coming out about £1.24 per day. So if we look at a kind of margin over feed costs, at the moment we're getting about live weight in Scotland. Average live weight for steers and heifers is about 372 pence per kilo across the market. So that's leaving us a margin over feed of about £2.48. And that's quite an important figure to look remember as we go through and look at intensive systems as well. So for managing semi-intensive rations, there's a few kind of rules of thumb that we need to think about. Expected dry matter intake should be between 2 to 2.5% of live weight. This will decrease with maturity, and it also depends on ration quality. So if we've got a really poor silage, for example, or a lower energy feed that we're putting in with that silage, that'll reduce the digestibility of the forage and also reduce our dry matter intake. So that's to optimize dry matter intakes, we need to be looking at getting that energy level as high as possible. For silage, or in some cases, if you're trying to finish outside at grass with a hopper, this must make up at least 40% of dry matter intake. Below this, additional fibre must be included, or if we are getting below this, an intensive ration should be considered. So if we're about like below 40%, we really need to be starting adding some straw into the mix. Or if we've not got that much forage, or we're really tight, we should really just be looking at straw as the main forage. Silage quality must be known to balance the ration, and there's my second time reminding you, please, please, please analyse the forage before you ask for a ration to be done. We cannot accurately ration finishing animals without knowing their forage base. Feed space allowance should be as ad lib, so we should be allowing a minimum 280 to 320 millimeters per head, or 28 to 32 centimeters. And this is really important to make sure that every animal can get in and eat and optimize intakes as much as possible. If we are feeding cereals in the ration or any hard concentrate feeds, this should be introduced gradually, especially if we've not been creeping before weaning. And while we're doing this, we should be keeping forage ad lib, and ad lib means in front of them all the time. If you've went in for your tea, not came out till 6, 7 o'clock in the morning again, and they finished their silage at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's not ad lib. We want them to be pretty much clearing every 24 hours and allowing that like feed in front of them all the time to optimize gain as much as possible. So with like introducing cereals, we should be aiming to increase our cereal ration by about half a kilo every kind of couple of days, 2 to 3 days, over the course of 10 to 14 days to get them onto the full ration. The rumen, it's a kind of marathon, not a sprint with the rumen. It takes about 2 weeks for the rumen to fully adjust to a new ration and for the microbes to fully adapt to the kind of new acids that are coming in with adding like more starch into the ration. So in order for that to function efficiently, we're better taking it slowly and steadily. It's a marathon, not a sprint, or a cargo ship, not a speedboat. It's slow and steady wins the race. And also the ration must be mineralized appropriately for the ration that we're offering. If you've got a silage-based diet, we'll find that silage can be a bit better in nutrients, but it will vary farm to farm. It can even vary field to field, depending on pHs, how well nutrient managed the field is, how fresh that lay is, what is in the lay. Is it a multi-species sward? Is it not? There's a lot of different variations. So we need to consider that. If there's kind of whole crop going in the ration, it's typically deficient in minerals compared to a silage. So that needs to be considered. And straw is quite low in mineral supplementation as well. So depending on what's in the ration, the mineral must be appropriate. Typically for finishing, we are looking at a typically higher calcium, low magnesium mineral. Typically, we're looking for a calcium phosphorus ratio of about 2 to 1. And we're looking for kind of high vitamin E, selenium for growth and health, and then also looking at vitamin D, so bone integrity. While we've got an animal growing quite fast, bone integrity is quite important. I have written a kind of just quick thing. Obviously, we have a bit of barley screenings going on. I don't think they're quite as abundant as they were about a month ago. They're starting to be taken up and we're starting to see them being integrated into other industries as well. So we've not quite got as many. But barley screenings, obviously, we're looking at small corn barley. There's a bit more husk in there. So it can vary compared to a typical barley sample. Obviously, barleys do vary as well. There's a big difference in nitrogens in barleys. But if your quality and feed value of your barley screenings or a barley sample is not known, we are better to analyze it for best results. Again, it's typically lower in energy, higher in fiber, but also higher in crude protein. So one way to look at that is, well, just a bit of a reminder, I did look at a few samples in a bit of a test, and we did start to notice a bit of a trend. I can't say I've got enough data to fully hold myself onto it, but we started to notice a trend that once bushel dropped below 52, which is very low, protein levels also dropped. So they were kind of protein was higher between 52 and 58 bushel, but then dropped below 52. But I think this will be due to a higher level of husks in the sample. If we do know our nitrogen content, we can times the nitrogen by 6.25, and that'll give us our crude protein on a dry matter basis. So if you have run it through a barley merchant's NIR machine and we know the nitrogen, that is a quick way just to check the protein in that ration. Although knowing the energy is beneficial just to get the ration fully right, but it is a quick way to check nitrogen if we've run it through already. So that takes me nicely on to more intensive barley rations and intensive finishing systems. So this is typically ad lib cereal, which will be supplemented with protein and minerals. And this has to be balanced with straw. So this really, really suits those areas of the country currently that are maybe down on forage, up on barley, and do have some straw kicking around. So probably more of the east of the country than further west or right up north into Highlands and Islands if there's anybody from up around there. So target daily live weight gains for steers, we're aiming for above 1.4 kilos per day, and we might find that for some kind of dairy beef animals that are intensively finished as well. We'll be looking at gains about 1.4 kilos a day. Bulls, we need to be reaching 1.6 kilos a day, ideally higher. So ideally we should be aiming around the kind of 1.8 average for a bull on an intensive bull ration. And we can see gains as high as 2 up to about 2.5. In some cases, we've seen really, really high. It just depends on genetic advantage. But the key thing to remember is that bulls must be away by 16 months. So we need to make sure these systems are optimized as much as possible. In terms of breed going on to an intensive finishing system, it suits a late maturing continentally bred bull or steer. It can be used for native cross cattle, but ideally we want to keep that for a shorter finishing period. So if we've had a good growth stage, we could do a kind of short, sharp finish of around 8 weeks just to kind of really optimize gain at the end for those animals. But taking them too far onto that, we can start to see issues with feet issues and a really high cereal diet for some of these native bred animals. So we do need to watch them quite closely on that, and make sure that it's very well balanced. And considerations and challenges with intensive finishing systems. It suits a year where cereals are cheap. So cereal availability, it is quite a high feed cost per day. So it does suit a year where cereals are cheap. Feed space is very, very important when it comes to cereal-based finishing. You're looking at kind of ad lib finishes, ad lib intakes. So we need to be optimizing feed space. We can't be having feed run out. We need to be trying to optimize forage intake. So straw is really important. We need to have an abundance of straw to get sufficient scratch into that rumen, and just to correct pH, because cereals will drop the pH of the rumen quite fast, and we'll discuss kind of some considerations in a couple of slides. And then for other feed requirements as well, we got to consider a protein source. Perhaps a liquid feed such as molasses can be beneficial, and kind of minerals or any necessary additives depending on the system. Again, you're looking at housing, so labour, fuel, bedding, vet med needs to be considered if we're looking at full enterprise margins. Um, just kind of, I've done similar for an intensive like finishing ration. So we've taken them through growing and finishing. It's similar to how I did the semi-intensive there. So we've looked at straw, barley, balancing with rapeseed meal and minerals. And we might actually consider adding a kind of molasses into that mix. And there might be some other considerations, but just for the sakes of today, it was easier to just look at a kind of simple straw, barley, rapeseed meal and mineral mix. We do need to maybe consider some other things, but average daily life weight gains in the growth stage could probably achieve about 1.65 kilos. We're needing a bit more protein just to make sure protein needs are met, and also make sure we're transitioning animals properly. Um, if these animals haven't been on an intensive creep from birth, so if we've been out at mum with grass and we're transitioning them across, this is quite a kind of careful process to get them up to full intensive feed rates. So we need to make sure we're optimized getting protein right at this stage, just to kind of ease that transition a bit more. So daily life weight gains will be 1.65 kilos. And then our cost per pounds per head was about 1.59 or 0.96 per kilo gain. So we can see in terms of per kilo gain, where we're working quite a bit cheaper than the semi-intensive ration. And our days on ration are quite a bit less at 106 days in the growth stage. Similar to finishing, we need to leave a finishing ration for cereal fed animals around 13% protein. We do need that little bit extra just for rumen function, compared to the 12% for semi-intensive. But we're looking at about 1.7 kilos of straw, which must be about 12 to 13% of dry matter intake. Barley about 10.5 kilos, rapeseed about 1.5, and then that's leaving us at a 1.76 kilo gain. So we can say we're really optimizing gains at this stage. Costs per pound per head was about £2.13, £1.21 at cost per kilo gain, or 132 days on the ration. Looking at our average margin over feed costs, that was about £2.51. So we can see that there's actually not much of a difference in between the intensive and semi-intensive rations this year. This will be largely down to barley just being a lot cheaper than it has been previously. But it was quite an interesting task to look at kind of our margin over feed costs. If we were looking at full enterprise margins, of course, we'd be looking at other costs such as bedding, We'd also be looking at vet and med costs, any kind of associated housing costs on labour as well, to get a full enterprise margin for that system. But looking at margin over feed costs starts to give us an idea about kind of how much we've got to play with, especially if you're in a system where you've bought in stores, and stores are obviously at a premium at the moment, which leaves our margins tight. Is looking at that as margin over feed costs gives us a good indication about where we're going. So managing intensive cereal-based rations, again, it's really important that we adapt cattle onto a cereal-based ration gradually, especially if we've only really been creeping like the last month before weaning, and they've maybe not got to full intake. So again, aim to increase your cereal and ration by 0.5 kilos every couple of days over the course of 10 to 14 days to kind of get them up to the full ration. It can be helpful to maybe start by kind of trough feeding and just start upping them until they can kind of eventually not clear. With a cereal-based ration, it should be in front of them at all times. If we're letting them clear completely and then they've got periods of clearing, that might lead to gorging. Gorging will lead to a sudden drop in pH, and we can lead to kind of issues such as acidosis, which can be obviously quite detrimental to performance. It's also important that we have kind of barley processed properly. So we're looking for a light crack, not too well, like not too heavily processed, or a kind of nice even roll, which when barley's quite dry can be difficult. So there is a kind of other options we can consider. Again, feed space should be as ad lib, so 28 to 32 centimeters per head, or millimeters I've got written here. Other considerations in the ration, if we don't have enough space on farm to be mixing feed or using straights, depending on the system, urea treatment or a urea plus enzyme treatment can be a really good alternative for intensive finishing. It'll increase the protein roughly by about 30%. And it also increases the pH of the barley up to about 9, so it makes it more alkaline. This is really beneficial as it kind of lessens the drop in pH in the rumen, so can make it a bit safe and reduce risk of acidosis slightly. Liquid feeds are always a good inclusion into cereal-based finishing rations, especially for optimizing intakes. So a kind of molasses blend can be quite helpful, adding a bit of additional sugars, which can help rumen microbes again. And it also reduces dust in the ration, which is quite beneficial. If you not want to work with straights, commercial balancer nuts can work really nicely in this situation as well. So quite often they're a blend of proteins, so it's quite a nice variation compared to just your single straight. But if you're on a larger unit, straights can definitely be more cost effective. But commercial balancer nuts are definitely a good option. And a rumen buffer should be something that should be considered, especially if you're not feeding treated barley. We need to make sure that a rumen buffer can be, the rumen is buffering properly. So, I mean, the best rumen buffer a ruminant has is its own saliva. So making sure it drinks plenty of water, which I've got a note on, is of utmost importance. But adding a kind of commercial buffer or a yeast or something similar just to kind of help those rumen microbes can be very beneficial. Straw, when supplied, must be clean and separate from bread bedding. If you do have chopped straw, it must be kept long. We're really needing long fibre, and we need to be looking at intakes between 12 to 13 kilos of dry matter intake, 12 to 13% of dry matter intake, sorry. So that roughly works out for a finishing animal above 450 kilos, you're looking at between 1.5 to 2 kilos of straw a day intakes on average. You should be always providing a clean source of fresh water to intakes, and minerals must be supplemented for an intensive finishing ration. So again, looking at your calcium phosphorus ratio, low magnesium, high vitamin E, sulfur should be included if you're feeding a urea treated cereal. And yeah, think about how that cereal is processed, because it is one of the most important things. If you can kick your intensive cereal ration and your book comes out completely white because you've made flour, that's probably not an ideal situation to be in. So moving on to extensive finishing based systems. So these are looking at more kind of grass based systems, longer finishes, lower costs, but a greater kind of time on farm. So we're looking at kind of forage-based finishes, so grass, silage. We might integrate some brassicas forage crops into there as well. Target daily live weight gains should, especially during the finishing period, lifetime gains might be a bit lower over the period, but during finishing, we should still be aiming for at least a kilo a day if we can. Breed, it really suits early to medium maturing native bred steers or heifers as much as possible. Um, Continental animals will kind of typically struggle to find that full finish on a just grass-based system unless we've done kind of a lot of years of adaptation to get our kind of breeding there. Um, so considerations and challenges, thinking about grass availability. Grass quality is one of the most important things as well. So how young is the sward? How well managed is it? What is soil pH? How good's nutrient uptake and nutrient balance to be getting kind of good growth? Are we looking at kind of reseeding regularly? Have we looked at kind of our quality of our lays as well? Grassland management is going to become one of the most important things for an extensive finishing system. Um, and we're looking at trying to optimize weight gain from forage alone, which it sometimes a year can be very, very difficult. And we might need to think about just changing the way we're looking at things a wee bit more and trying to get that fat cover, especially when we've typically got quite an overage of protein, can be quite difficult as well. So we maybe need to consider options around then. So looking at kind of at how that might typically look. In winter, quite often these calves will be weaned and then go on to a kind of store period. It's quite hard with winter grazing availability to really push them on too hard during winter. So we might be looking at a kind of outwintering system, whereas obviously we've got challenges with the environment. We'll have an increased need for maintenance. So gains can be kind of lessened that way and that can affect kind of intakes at times as well. So you might look at systems such as kind of bale grazing on some quite decent quality forage outside. Might look at kind of brassica mixes. So thinking about a kind of root crop or a kind of kale stubble turnip mix can work quite nicely, and then feeding a wee bit of silage alongside that. Or you can maybe house and looking at kind of a forage, but you need to make sure your minerals are also included in that. That store period, we can kind of accept a bit less gains on that. So sometimes between 0.6 and 0.8 kilos is acceptable during store period because quite often we can maybe see a bit of compensation during summer. Depending, compensated growth will depend on how much we restrict during winter though. So for summer, we're looking at trying to optimize finishing at grass. So once we've got good summer grazing, then we're looking at trying to optimize intakes of grass as much as possible. So quite often looking at a kind of rotational grazing type system or strip grazing just to try and make sure we're keeping the freshest grass in front of them and optimizing intakes and grass quality and growth as much as possible. Ideally, we should be moving, if we're not kind of doing that, more of a paddock grazing system and with regular moves would be preferred. It's just important that we're trying to keep the optimum quality of grass in front of them if we are trying to finish at grass into a following summer. We may see some compensated growth. That'll depend on the period of restriction over winter. But you want to make sure you're still gaining over winter as much as possible. And we need to watch how we're restricting, especially if we're looking at kind of heifers, for example. Too much of a restriction may affect fertility if you're looking, well, we're kind of more looking at finishing systems in that, but that was just a note for anybody keeping heifers really. But yeah, you want to kind of be looking at a kind of 0.5, 0.6 kilo gain maybe over winter to get a bit of compensation over summer so we can maybe get kind of 1.2 gains at grass. Grazing quality should be as good as possible, so at least above 11 ME. So we're looking at quite good swards as much as possible and well managed. And we are trying to aim for like optimizing gains at grass. If we're not getting gains of a kilo a day, we really need to be reviewing the system and looking at alternatives as well. And this is probably when supplementation would be recommended. It can, especially with summer grazing, we have quite a lot of protein going around, and can sometimes be difficult just to get a full finish on their back. And this is where we should maybe consider just like a couple of kilos of cereal or a decent kind of high energy, lower protein beef nut or something, just to get that final finish on if we're struggling to fully get them away from grass. But it's, yeah, must be considered. There should always be a plan B. And just to kind of be note on grass quality throughout the season, grass kind of optimal quality will be our kind of young grass before we kind of get to kind of stem extension. As we go to stem extension, we find that will kind of lower quality. So that kind of young grass, that just early leaf stage up to the kind of third leaf is about 11.5 ME. Once we get into stem extension, we're looking at about 10.5. So we're like losing that quality again. And poor quality grazing is when we start to see a lot of dead leaf below, which is something that we can start to see a lot more in the back end, or when grass shoots away from us a lot more. And that significantly reduces energy, and that would subsequently affect weight gain quite heavily as well. So we just need to think about how kind of grass is managed and optimizing that as much as possible for forage-based systems. So I just kind of wanted to, like, kind of last couple of slides, just going to quickly do a bit of an overview about where we're at with silage quality so far. So this is all the silages that we've put through a silage lab we are currently using for this year so far. So this is up to about kind of middle of this month. And we can see that this year we've seen dry matter increase compared to previous years. So dry matter compared to 2024 is up at, for all silages, at 39.9% compared to 34.1 last year. So typically samples have came back quite a lot drier. If we look at this as fed intakes, it would mean that this year we would expect them to eat about 0.42 kilos as fed less per kilo dry matter you're feeding. So we'll find that naturally silage intakes will be a bit lower this year, just if it's drier. There is some really wet cuts coming though, so please analyze your silage, because everyone's situation will be different where you are in the country. Crude proteins have definitely seen a lift on average compared to this time last year. So we've seen protein up quite significantly, from about kind of 11.2% up to about 12.2%. So we've definitely seen quite a lift in protein. Energy has suffered slightly though, and we've seen a bit of a decrease in energy, down from an average of 10.6 last year to an average of 10.3. We can see that our kind of big bale silage is probably the lowest in energy we're seeing, whereas our first and second cuts are kind of finding average energies around that 10.5 mark. With there's a couple of third cuts coming which are very high. So these will probably be dairy systems compared to a lot of beef systems we're looking at today. But yeah, we can start to see a bit of a balance. I think one thing was quite interesting is we did see some wet silages, which were showing quite high levels of volatile fatty acids. So looking at acetic, propionic, butyric acids, these can significantly affect intakes and performance if we've got levels too high. And so far, we've had about 4.4% of silages submitted with a VFA of more than 45 grams per kilogram. So if you have seen a high VFA silage, please consult your nutritionist just to make sure we can try and balance that as much as possible to optimize performance. So just to kind of round us off, we'll do a kind of quick feed update. Feed industry has been quite interesting this year. There's been a lot of variation. We've seen cereals definitely drop again in price, similar to where we've seen them a lot of years ago. I know when I started in the industry, its prices are not far off where they are now, which is quite a lot to take in. It is beneficial when we're looking at feed costs though, so that's always good, especially for straights. Barley is undoubtedly the most competitive cereal we have available at the moment. I've popped in relative feed values for everyone as well. I'm not sure whether these slides will be, I think these slides will be shared, so you can maybe have a look at this in a bit more detail. These prices are indicative ex farm or dock, and they will vary depending on location, load size, and stuff like that. So please do not take them as gospel. There will be variations depending on how much you're taking, but it gives us a rough indication. But yes, overall in UK, barley volume's been low, but prices are definitely very competitive against other cereals. Wheat price is typically tracking where we would see it, but there's maybe a bit of a bigger gap between barley and wheat than we've seen in the past. Oats are kind of quite hard to get a hold of at the moment. Also a bit less feed value than barley, which kind of makes it hard, a bit kind of less of an attractive choice for feeding. Quite a safe feed though, if you do have some. And maize is sitting quite high above the relative feed value at the moment. When it comes to proteins, soya is quite cheap at the moment, and kind of quite very competitive in the market. Rapeseed meal is also very competitive, and sitting just behind soya, really. Distillers have been quite interesting this year. You've probably heard about bioethanol plants closing due to trade agreements. So that has meant that their main source of distillers is now imported, which is making them not quite as an attractive option to feed. We've also seen a bit of a reduction in like distillers from maltings and distilleries across Scotland. So we've not got quite as much of a UK source of distillers. We've not really got that much draft going around as well, and what draft there is available to agriculture is currently kind of tied up in quite a lot of dairy. So if you do have draft, it's great as a forage extender, but there's not that much going about, similar to pot ale syrup as well. If we are looking for a kind of a locally grown protein source at the moment, beans are probably our best option if you can get a hold of some. They do work really well in finishing rations if you've got some available. Quite nice, high in energy, high in about 26% protein on the dry matter as well. So quite a good addition to a finishing ration, a bean. It can work quite well in some systems. With fibre, we have seen kind of beet pulp. Unsurprisingly, the beet pulp harvest was slightly reduced due to dry conditions in the south. That's pushed prices up at the moment. So beet pulps, against its relative feed value, is probably quite an expensive feed. Soya hulls is probably a little bit more competitive again, if you are needing a fibre source in a ration, other than forage. And then we've got a kind of bit of a maize gluten price there. But yeah, in turn, some things are up on the year depending on what. So if we look at some of our distillers, our fibre sources such as beet pulp, soya hulls, things like other additions into feeds are all kind of up, but our cereals and soya are both down pretty much on feed. So that is me for the evening. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take a couple.
Good. Thank you very much for that, Lorna. So we will just start to wrap up for tonight. So I would like to share what I think should be our takeaway messages from tonight, and certainly what I've gained is ultimately get your feed analysed, whether that is your silages or barley. And we should be monitoring our growth rates to ensure that we are hitting the targets that we specify, especially this year when many finishers have bought cattle at really high prices and margins are tight. So it's making sure we're meeting those targets that Lorna set out in the different systems. And I think we need to be a wee bit flexible as to what we include in our rations this year, because what we've done in previous years might not work now, just with all the changes that's happened in availability, and ensure that we're meeting those specs. So I'd just like to remind you of the other webinars in this series. So our next one is Health on the 11th of November, and then we wrap up with marketing on the 2nd of December. You can sign up for those webinars on the Farm Advisory Service events page now, and would like to see you there if possible.